Hello, everyone. Welcome to Assign's webinar, Between Worlds, Growing Up with Deaf Parents and Advocating for Accessible Communication. My name is Roxanne Whiting. I'm one of the owners of Asign, and I'm also a sign language interpreter. And my role here at Asign is Director of Business Development. So we have an interpreter here today to make this webinar accessible. I'm also fluent in ASL, but today we're using the talents of another interpreter, which is great. So thank you for being here. So I grew up with deaf parents, and in our community, we refer to people like me as a CODA, a child of deaf adults. Now, that can be two parents that are profoundly deaf, or one parent that's deaf and the other that has some hearing. There's a whole, mixture of what could be considered a CODA, but essentially living and growing up with parents that use sign language to communicate and are deaf. My parents, my mom was completely deaf, and my father hard of hearing. So he could use some language like English, but primarily use sign language to communicate. So ever since I was growing up, I didn't know anything different, obviously, and going to school, I don't know, I started reading at a very early age, and I was able to communicate well. And so a lot of times my teachers wanted me to share my experience about living with deaf parents and things like that. So advocating and speaking about my experiences and the deaf community has been something I've been doing for a very long time. And later, after high school, I decided that I was going to pursue interpreting. And so I did that and graduated in 1998. I moved back to Ottawa. And at the time, Asign was called Sign Language Interpreting Associates Ottawa. In 2023, we rebranded to Asign, and we're now across Canada and no longer just in Ottawa. So lots of big changes, but working with Asign over the years gave me and my colleagues, and I'll talk about our company in a little bit, but just an opportunity to advocate for the deaf community in terms of getting accessibility to information and communication at work, education, and all areas of life, really, wherever they need an interpreter or other type of translation or communication services, we've been there to support that. Last year, we Asign placed in one of the top 20 finalists for the Tell Us Stand With Owners competition, which was really amazing. With that, we got some fun prizes and also some money to put towards some of the projects we're working on here at Asign. So that was an honor to be recognized for the work that we do across Canada. And in 2022, I was the recipient of the Businesswoman of the Year award here in Ottawa. And again, that's testament to all of the work that we do here at Asign, and again, advocating for accessible communication. And so that was great because it just brings the services that we do to a broader audience with these type of awards and recognition for our company. I am married, 22 years, and I've got two kids, teenagers now, heading into a whole different world. And I've got two dogs, so I'm a dog mom too. So if we move to the next slide, as I mentioned, Asign is now Canada-wide. We're in a company led by interpreters. So there's three owners, and the three of us are sign language interpreters. all of the interpreters that work with us have a deep passion to supporting the deaf community and each other in terms of professional development and supporting the deaf community and their goals. We're women owned and led. And recently, we became certified in 4 different ISO standards, which has been a really great experience, tough experience for anybody who's gone through that. But it just proves that our processes and approaches to the way that we provide our services are established, and we can be counted on to provide the services that we've been doing since 1997. We're also a certified diverse supplier with WeBe Canada and We Connect International. So that gives us lots of opportunities to network with other women-owned businesses and support each other in the evolution and growth of our companies. So next slide. That's a picture of my parents and me and my brother. I think it was about, I don't know, 5 or 6 there. Often people that haven't had any experience with the deaf community or meeting somebody that has deaf parents, they have, I think a lot of people have these misconceptions of what it's like to be deaf or what it must be like growing up in a household with deaf parents. Often I hear it must have been really quiet growing up, and it couldn't be just the opposite. I mean, in some respects, some things were quiet, but if you think about it, you know, a deaf person can't hear themselves um, in the kitchen. So cupboards banging or doing dishes very early in the morning, pots and pans. Um, Sometimes, you know, turning on the water and then maybe getting distracted by something else and then coming back to almost a fully flooded kitchen because they didn't hear the water running. And so lots of fun memories with that in mind. So it can be loud in a deaf household, that's for sure. Both of my brother and I can hear. So as we were growing up, you kind of get accustomed to those noises. So you don't know anything different until you go to someone else's house and realize, oh, it's a bit more quiet over here. And so just being aware of our behaviors too. So we probably got used to slamming kitchen cupboards and things like that. But some of the tools and technologies that we had and that my parents used growing up, because a lot of people would ask, well, how did your parents know when you were a baby if you were crying? Or if, you know, how did they know? And so I was born in the 70s, and they did have some technology there where, um, and I don't even know the name of the instrument, but it would be attached to the doorbell or a lamp, for example. So when I would cry, it was attached to, I guess, the baby monitor that would make a noise and flash the bedroom light or other lights in the house for my parents. So then they would be alerted that I was crying. So that's how they knew to come check on me. That same technology would work for the front door if someone was at the door ringing the doorbell. Um, so there's even like alarms, like flashing lights to wake up in the morning, or having a little machine that they would put under the mattress that would vibrate when the alarm went off to wake them up. So deaf people very sensitive to vibrations and lights, right? Just using their eyesight much more than we do because we can depend on our hearing and also our vision. Um, One of the big things about telephone communication, because often at that time we use something here in Ontario called Bell Relay Service. So Bell Canada, other provinces, would have their similar service. And how that would work is that at the time, there was a TTY, and that was the technology used. And you'd have to take the telephone with the, big receivers on either end and plunk it on top of this TTY. The deaf person, let's say, was calling, I don't know, a family member that over the telephone. So they would first connect with the Bell Relay Service operator through the TTY and then provide the phone number to the operator, and the operator would use the telephone and call the person they were calling. And everything that was said was typed out between my mom or my dad, between the operator, and the operator would then say whatever was being typed over the telephone, and vice versa. When the person responded in English, she would or he would type out what they were saying. So lots of pros and cons with that. I mean, deaf people were able to communicate over the telephone, but however, English and French, written language is often not the first language of deaf people. So lots of misunderstandings between the operators that may or may not have had any training on deaf culture or understanding of the deaf community. So sometimes those conversations would be confusing. And so you might want to have an in-person meeting with an interpreter if that was available. When we compare that to today, now we have video technology and high-speed internet. So things have really changed in that respect. Codas of my time were often used to call people instead of going through the operator through Bell Relay so that we could get our message across faster because we could understand our parents signing their message and we could interpret that over the telephone. But now deaf people are empowered to make those calls themselves using their first language over video. So using Canada Video Relay Service, they register for a 10-digit phone number and anybody can call them or they can call out to anybody through the interpreter and using sign language. So the interpreter and the deaf person are connected over video and the interpreter calls out using an audio line through the video application. So lots of big changes there, but it really empowers the deaf community and all of the community too to have that functional accessibility so they can call the doctor's office, they can call the school, they can call home and have a chat with mom, order a pizza, all those things that we take for granted using the telephone. Now, deaf culture versus hearing culture, and the first misconception is, or what people don't realize, is that the deaf community is a culture of its own, and they identify with different norms and standards that make up a culture, and just like different cultures around the world. So one of the hallmarks or the easy things, like I spoke about flashing lights, but getting someone's attention, you can also use those lights or wave hands or stomp on the floor or gently touch someone's shoulder. So if you're in a room and trying to get someone's attention across the room, you would just wave and through their peripheral vision, they might see that. And if not, someone else in the room might see it and then tap that person on the shoulder if they were kind of far away from you. Whereas in hearing culture, you might see somebody that you want to speak with. And if they're speaking with someone else, you're not going to call out their name right away. You'll wait and um, then call out their name when it looks like there's a break in the conversation. So there's some different ways to approach people in both cultures on when you want to speak with someone. Greetings is something that's quite different too. Now, within the deaf community, deaf people were sent to residential schools. That's changed a little bit. There are still residential schools for the deaf here in Canada, a lot fewer than what there was back when my parents were going to school. Um, so when kids were sent to these schools, they lived there most of the year, saw their parents on the weekends, um, maybe over holidays, but for the most part, their friends at school became their family. They shared dorms together, they went to classes together. And so it's a very important part of their identity and their background. That's where they were able to use sign language because often when they were going home on holidays and visits, their parents most often did not use sign language. And so they were able to freely communicate and express themselves with their peers when they were at school. So typically, when you meet a deaf person, um, they would share their name, show their name sign because everybody has a sign name, so they're not spelling out their name each and every time. And they'll want to know what residential school the person went to. Or in my case, if I'm meeting someone for the first time, I would tell them my name sign, and then I would say, my parents are deaf. Do you know them? And I would say, do you know Marshall or Betty Ann Whiting? And so they would say, well, what school? And I would say Belleville. And then we'd kind of go through the process to figure out, oh, who do we know in the community about each other? And that's the first step at kind of acquainting ourselves with each other. And then the conversation will flow from there. In hearing culture, typically, you'll meet someone and you'll give your name and you'll say where you work or you went to school or what city you're from. And if you're, depending on the context, um, you might move on to the next person if you're in a networking situation or talk about um, your role. And you don't really get into personal details until you get to know that person a little bit more. So, um, some of you may have already met some deaf people and recognize this difference in communication. But if you haven't, that's what you can pretty much expect. And often what happens when there are events where deaf and non-deaf or hearing people are in the same room, they'll see a couple of people signing. And if there isn't a way to walk around them, they're very hesitant to just walk through the conversation because in hearing culture, it's rude to do that. But with deaf people, it's rude to kind of hover and, you know, wait for an opportunity to pass through. It's actually a lot better if you just walk through the conversation. They won't miss a beat. They'll keep communicating and it's not bothering them at all. Whereas in hearing culture, that would be considered a little off-putting. It's like, oh, they it breaks our concentration. So it's typically you would apologize profusely for that, but with deaf people, it's just a normal thing. Deaf people are tend to be, very to the point, um, come across with, you know, clear candor. They don't mind asking those tough questions, whereas in hearing culture, we might until we get to really know somebody, you might not be as direct with your questions or comments. An example, sometimes I laugh because, I will get to an event and if I've changed my hair, for example, maybe I've put highlights in it and trimmed it a little bit shorter than I normally do. Some people that know me well in the deaf community might say, oh, why did you do that? It doesn't look good. Your old hairstyle looked better. Whereas if I was meeting with some hearing colleagues, they might say, oh, you changed your hair, or they might not say anything at all because if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say it at all, right? So it, there's definitely different things that come up, and a lot of them make me laugh just because I'm used to it, but it could be off-putting if you're not used to that. But sure, it's what they see will come out. If you're wearing a nice shirt and you look lovely, they'll be sure to tell you that too. So um, we can move on to the next slide. Now, sign language interpreting is obviously an important factor for the deaf community. Now, deaf people require interpreters in lots of different circumstances, but um, have found ways to function without an interpreter. They don't need an interpreter every moment of the day, but certainly for those important life events, work events, and other things, it's quite important. So interpreting is, facilitating communication between someone using spoken language and sign language. And some of you may or may not know that in 2019, the Accessible Canada Act was became law here in Canada, which is great, and it recognizes ASL, American Sign Language, and the Langue de Signes Québécois, LSQ, as the primary languages for communication for deaf people in Canada. Now, because of this, and even before this was passed, there's always been a demand for sign language interpreters. Sign language interpreters, there are interpreting programs across Canada. Some of those programs have unfortunately closed, but there are efforts to bring those programs back into place, and the federal government has committed funding to ensure that more people become interested in pursuing a career in sign language interpretation because of the demand. And because of this new legislation, the increased demand in sign language interpretation will increase over time. And it has already. I can assure you at Asign, we get lots and lots of requests, and especially since this law was passed. So if you know of someone that's good with languages, please encourage them to consider sign language interpreting. There's a high need for it, and lots of opportunity for employment in different areas. And it's something, like I said, interpreters are needed for all sorts of different communication events. Now, sign language isn't universal. This is one thing that a lot of people misunderstand. They think that sign language is the same in every country, but for every spoken language, there is a sign language, pretty much. Um, sign language is not signed English. So English is its own language in its truest form, its own grammar and syntax, and that's the same with ASL and LSQ and other sign languages. The discourse is different, how just everything. The grammar is on the face for sign language. So if your eyebrows are up, you might be asking a question, or your tone is expressed through your body movements and your face. Tense is leaning forward or backwards to indicate time. There's so many different differences between sign languages and spoken language that are just not understood. And because of that, some of the assumptions with providing accessibility is that closed captioning in English or French or other spoken languages in their comparative written language will be okay. And that's enough accessibility for the deaf community. It really isn't enough. And again, because signed languages and spoken languages are so very different, a lot of the meaning, intent behind the messages being spoken will get lost in just the written word to someone that uses sign language as their primary language. So it's really important to consider adding sign language translation in addition to the captionings that you're using to make sure that any digital content that you have online or that you provide internally at your organization is accessible in ASL and LSQ as well. So that could be training materials or um, any communication, emergency communication. We saw a lot of that with the COVID pandemic updates and things like that. So this is where really want to make sure that you're providing full access. Okay, this is kind of a funny slide because this is what sign language interpreting isn't. So on, well, my left, and I think everybody's left, we're all looking the same way, I think. Anyway, where we see a woman interpreting, and at the top of the window it says fraud. So basically, this was a fake interpreter, and unfortunately, this happens more than we would like. Um, there's a misconception out there that anybody knowing some sign language can interpret. And so, unfortunately, these people are brought in, and in this case, a live broadcast, a news conference, um, to interpret, you know, news coverages and other events. And when the deaf community is watching, it's an utter disappointment because they're not interpreting anything. They're using the few signs that they know and trying to do their best. So, how it's really important to make sure that the interpreters that you're bringing on are professional and fluent. And if they are, they should be a member, an active member of the Canadian Association of Sign Language Interpreters, which is our professional association. In addition, they may work for different agencies that require accreditation, like the Translation Bureau, the Ministry Attorney General, etc. So do your homework before you hire an interpreter for that case. And then on the right-hand side, something that's been really um, coming out a lot more and is really fantastic is that deaf performers are on stage, and in this example, the Super Bowl halftime show. Um, so they're not interpreting. In a sense, they are performing music or in this case it's music, right? So they're performing the music, they practice, they study, and it's their interpretation of that artist or of that music, and they perform it, which is very different from interpreting, because interpreting, you are interpreting concepts, words, and ideas in from one language to the other. Um, so next time you're watching something on television, see if you can spot if it's a real interpreter, which most of the time it is, but sometimes they get through with the fake interpreters. And then, of course, there's more opportunity now online for deaf performance, but even in your local communities, deaf theater, lots of theaters now are hosting ASL. Um, some of the performances are done in ASL with deaf performers. And so keep your eyes out for that, because that might be something that you might want to check out. It's part of the culture. So our next slide, we're talking about deaf interpreters. So we've talked about the ASL interpreter or LSQ interpreter, which is typically a hearing person like myself that is trained, and we interpret. And so deaf interpreters are also trained, but they're born deaf or they're hard of hearing. And the reason deaf interpreters are brought in to work in a team with a hearing interpreter is to ensure that communication is 100% clear for a deaf audience. So in the picture you see on this slide, you see a deaf interpreter. Now, he is watching a hearing interpreter off-site. So the hearing interpreter is listening to the speaker and interpreting from English to ASL in this case, what's being said. The deaf interpreter is watching the hearing interpreter's interpretation and taking that message and interpreting it in an ASL that would be accessible to a wider audience. Now, how they can do that is because their first language is ASL. They have the lived experience as a deaf person. They understand that deaf people have a range of language skills, and depending on where they live across the country, they may use different signs. Like in the Maritimes, they have maritime sign language. There's different regionalisms and regional signs across the country. So what they do is they're able to incorporate all of those different factors into their interpretation to ensure that the viewer, no matter what their language level or where they're from, um, is able to fully understand the message. So maybe another example to highlight where a deaf interpreter would really be beneficial is at Service Canada centres. So Asign provides on-demand interpreting to Service Canada in both ASL and LSQ. And deaf people, or just like every other Canadian, Canadians can go into any office and apply for a passport or CPP or employment insurance, whatever the case may be. Now, if that deaf person just moved here from another country and are seeking supports, they may not be fluent in sign language, in American Sign Language or the langue de signes de Québécois. So they might have a few signs, but they're really, using the sign language from the country that they're from. So when a Service Canada agent connects with one of our interpreters, the interpreter may initially try to communicate with that person and realize that they're not really understanding what they're saying. So internally, we'll call the assistance of a deaf interpreter that will come on, and that deaf interpreter will introduce themselves. I talked about greetings earlier. Try and get a feel for their sign, ask where they're from, um, and then they'll use different gestures. Sometimes they use a whiteboard and images to get across their message. And again, it's working with the hearing interpreter, the deaf interpreter, and all the parties involved in the conversation. They really just take a step back and make sure that everybody's being understood. Usually, deaf interpreters are brought in for complicated situations. So again, the example here was a coronavirus briefing that happened live in Alberta, but it could also be for young children, deaf children, who are learning ASL, but again, the interpreter may not be familiar with children's signs. So we'll need a deaf interpreter who has that experience, possibly from their childhood, but also raising deaf children or interacting with deaf children. It could be in a legal situation to make sure that the terms and conditions of whatever matters going on are very, very clear. There's a whole host of reasons where deaf interpreters are needed, and we certainly support that. And if a deaf person themselves asks for the support of bringing in a deaf interpreter, then one should be requested. Maybe we can move on to the next slide, talking about who can be an interpreter. Well, it's not just anybody, and I did touch on this a few moments ago. Interpreters take interpreter training. Ideally, they have knowledge of sign language before they enter an interpreter training program. A lot of these programs have an expectation that you do have sign language fluency before you enter the program. The community colleges, private agencies across the country offer sign language interpretation, sign language classes. Um, and then some of those same colleges offer interpreting programs. Um, Once an interpreter or individual goes through an interpreting program, there's often practicum, different opportunities for them to practice and be mentored by more experienced interpreters and interact with the community, which is really essential, especially in the sign language community because it's so small. And then they become active members of the professional association. Now, when they go on to be employed by different agencies or companies, they may have additional requirements that they have to go through to be able to work in different environments. So at Asign, some of our interpreters are required to get different security clearances because of the different work that we do amongst the federal government and other agencies. So it's certainly an expectation that interpreters are very comfortable using ASL, be bilingual, have a very deep and strong understanding of deaf culture, but also other cultures like hearing culture, Canadian culture, and are able to move between both very seamlessly. So, in terms of making your information accessible, there's different ways, like we've talked about. Um, we've mentioned that sign language is a primary language, it's their first language, so ideally you're using that. And there's different ways to do that. So I've talked about interpreting in general, but interpreting can be bringing in an interpreter in person. It can be remotely using video like we're doing today. And you can also do translation. So translation, we'll show you an example soon, but is taking text-based content and creating that in a video format using ASL or LSQ or other sign languages, and then placing that either on your website or internally creating videos or other things to make that content accessible. I see a question, and like in the Q&A where, and I'll just read it out. It says, I see some social media influencers speaking English while signing ASL as they're speaking. So you're saying what they are signing isn't technically grammatically correct in ASL. And I think for the most part, it's very difficult to be grammatically accurate in two languages at the same time. Like if you're speaking in English and signing in ASL, you're probably leaning more towards signed exact English. So you're not quite signing in ASL. You might be signing some of those words using the ASL sign. However, without seeing the specific example that you're speaking about, um, lots of misunderstandings can still happen, and it's possible that they're not being grammatically correct. Maybe in that I've seen some of those videos too where people are speaking English and signing at the same time. And I've tried that, certainly trying to bridge the gap sometimes where, um, very quickly just trying to make sure that two people can communicate because I'm the only one that knows both languages. And it's very challenging to make sure that you're being correct in both English and ASL. So my recommendation would be to stick to one language so that you can be grammatically correct in which language you're using. And so some people now in social media um, are doing a lot of videos in ASL, and there's a lot of people doing videos in ASL that are hearing. They might be a coda, they might have a background. Um, within the deaf community, but there's a lot of people I think out there too that are learning ASL and trying to teach ASL when maybe they shouldn't be. There's strong support for sign language being taught by the deaf community, by people who are fluent in ASL and have that cultural background. So something to consider. On the next slide, we're going to show you the difference between interpreting and translation. Now, interpretation is meant for live interactions, and translation is meant for finished content. So we'll press play, and you'll see here this example of a translation. So you'll see here what we did was there's captioning of what the text message is saying and an ASL translation of that text. So it's accessible to anybody, right? So if you didn't understand sign language, you could still read the captions or the subtitles to follow what's being said in American Sign Language. Now, when you'll need an interpreter, we've talked about this, presentations such as this, training, uh, large presentations, in-person events, staff meetings, um, video relay service now, right? Telephone calls, things of that nature. And translation is something more for when you're communicating important information, such as training materials or company policies, legislation. We're getting lots of requests to translate different policies and legislation coming through the federal government. So those kind of things you can keep in mind for your own organization about things that you might want to communicate via your website about the information or services that you offer to the public. And if deaf people see that you're offering communication access through your website or through other means, then they'll feel more comfortable contacting you for services. If they don't see that you're accessible, they may never reach out unless they're referred specifically. So it's really important if you're trying to reach the deaf community to make your content accessible through translation, and then also when they're reaching out to provide an interpreter whenever possible. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. Now, I'll just open the Q&A. Someone is asking, can you clarify why recordings of ASL interpreted workshops and webinars are not always openly shared? So this has become, it's challenging for sign language interpreters because, and I would imagine for any speaker, I don't see anybody here on the screen except for the interpreter. And so you're not getting that feedback back from whomever's watching, the audience. So if you think about the interpreter, when we're working with the deaf community, with a deaf person, as we're signing, they are letting us know in different ways that they're understanding what we're interpreting. They're understanding the message and knowing if we're on the right track. And with that live feedback, they might tell us, oh no, here's a different sign for that, or they'll clarify something, and that helps us while we're interpreting to make sure that the end user, the person watching the interpretation, is understanding the full message. Now, when there's live presentations, webinars such as this that are recorded, and the ASL interpreter doesn't have that immediate feedback, then that's a recorded message where they didn't have any direct interaction with the end user. So that's one reason where sometimes recordings are not shared. There could be other reasons as well. And again, it's a relatively new trend. If we consider before COVID, a lot of interpreters were not used over video. And then since COVID, the demand increased, right? That was the only way people were talking and communicating was over video. So I think the requests became more and more. So I think the interpreting community is adapting, and a lot of these videos or webinars or other presentations that are recorded with ASL interpretation are becoming more widely accepted as being recorded. So I'm not able to provide any other reasons. So you're welcome. So are there any other questions, comments? Okay, well, if something comes to mind after this, I'm happy to answer anything. If you have questions about our services, um, my contact information is up on the screen. Also, our main office. If you wish to schedule an interpreter for one of your events, you can always reach out and we'll be happy to speak with you. So, with that, I appreciate your time here today. Thank you to our interpreter, and I wish you all a great day. Thank you.